Hi class, hi painters. This video is going to be a quick demonstration of how we initially lay our colors on the palette and how we organize our palette. So your first painting project will be an achromatic painting on a 5x7 canvas. So achromatic meaning no color, no defined hues. We're going to use your titanium white and we're going to use your ivory black. When you're setting up your palette with your pure colors, you're going to put all of the pure colors, that means the colors right out of the tube, on the side of the palette that's farthest away from you. And what that does is it opens up all of this space on the palette for mixing colors. Y'all might not realize it yet, but y'all are going to be mixing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of colors this semester. It is one of my strengths as an artist and a teacher, and I want it to be one of your strengths as artists and designers as well, that you can perceive and record and simulate really dramatic as well as very subtle value, temperature, hue, and intensity shifts with color. So I've squeezed out a little bit of this titanium white, or permalba white is what I like to use. And I've put it the white always goes on the upper left-hand side of the palette because it's the lightest light you can possibly get. Okay, when we place the colors, the pure colors on the palette, we place them, we organize them in a way that defines their relationships to one another. And that helps you think through mixing colors. So if white is our lightest light, it goes way over here, almost like it's one side of a value scale. The ivory black in this scenario is the darkest dark we could possibly get. You can't get any darker than that in this scenario. And then we leave lots of room in the middle to mix these two together in various quantities to get every value shift or every possible value, from one extreme to the other. That makes perfect sense. And that way, it also helps you when you leave a work day and come back to a work day, because the placement of the colors will make some kind of logical sense. It'll make rational sense. You'll be able to kind of match it to locations in your composition without having to, remix everything or take steps backwards. Okay, so using the palette knife, right? Here's my palette knife with my nice little elbow. It's important whenever you're placing your palette knife into a pure color or a color you've been mixing, it should always be clean. So always wipe it really well with the towel, and it should be perfectly clean. To get pure color, and I'll just start, maybe we'll start just by mixing a middle tone, a perfect middle tone. I kind of cut into the pure paint and I just kind of scoop it out like it's a spoon or a trowel. And then I'm just gonna press it into the paper. You'll notice with my palette knife, I'm constantly rolling it around in my fingers. So when I'm pressing it down, I'm actually rolling it with my fingers, more than I'm using my arm or my wrist. So it's the really great thing about the handle of your palette knife, being a little bit rounded, especially towards the metal part. So I've got a little bit of white. Now you have to immediately wipe off the excess from your palette knife. And then I'm going to cut into a little bit of the black and rotate and scoop it up, almost like it's a spoon. And then I turn it upside down and just press it down, okay? And wipe it off. So I have no idea if this is going to make a perfect middle tone yet. There is no formula. I can't tell you, 2 parts black to 1 part white, or 5 parts white to 1 part black. Each brand of oil paint and also each pigment of oil paint is going to have a different tinting strength, and you just kind of never know. Y'all will develop a sensitivity to the paint that you've bought, and so over time with practice and experience, you'll be able to kind of intuit how much of each color you'll need. So now I'm going to mix the gray together, and this is my technique for using the palette knife. Okay, so again, you can roll this in your fingers. Okay, so what I do is I mostly use, you can kind of see the top half of the palette knife for mixing. If you get too far down here, it gets gunky. And what you want to do is turning this on its side. It's almost like a bulldozer. You push it and smush it from one side, then you roll it, push it, and smush it from the other side. Push and smush. The old push and smush. You can do it from the back too. Push and smush, push and smush, and then from the sides. What this does is it keeps the paint in a kind of a consolidated pile, rather than just smushing it like this and then going around and around and around. One, this doesn't feel good. It feels yucky to me. But two, it takes up a lot of space, a lot of real estate on the palette, and that's valuable real estate. If you do have a pile of paint that starts to kind of take up too much space, you can use your palette knife almost like a scraper. Turn it on its side. Again, just using really the top half of the knife. See? And then smush it back down. Okay? So make sure that all the paint is incorporated really well. I'll move this down so maybe y'all can see a little bit better. Good. So you should see no streaks. It's normal for the palette knife to feel awkward at first, so don't be alarmed if it takes a little bit of practice for it to feel natural. Okay, so as I look at this value, it looks a little bit darker than middle tone. So even though I used more white in that mixture, that black is just so strong, it made it a little bit darker. So I wipe my palette knife clean so that I can get some white. Okay. It's important to always use a cleaned palette knife when you're getting pure colors to put into a mixture, because one, you spent a lot of money on these pure pigments, and two, when you're mixing your colors, you need to know what you're working with. If I got a little bit of black in here, even if it was just a tiny little smidge, then every time I used this white into another mixture of color, that color would be a little bit kind of gray, a little bit duller, a little bit deader. So it's important to keep your colors pure. That's another reason why we keep your pure colors, far away on the palette. Okay, it's getting a little bit closer. Your first task, oh, I got it a little dirty. Look at that. I'm not following my own advice. I rushed. Your first task for your first painting is going to be to mix at least 6 different values from white to black. I would shoot for even more, maybe even 10. What I want you to do is mix a fresh pile of paint for every value shift, right? So do not just take a little bit of this pile and white to put in the middle, because then you're gonna rob this paint or this pile of paint. I want you to get as much practice as possible getting fresh paint and leaving yourself with plenty of paint to make the painting. Okay, good. That's somewhere in the middle. An interesting psychological and perceptual fact is that for the most part, most people tend to make things much much lighter than they actually are. When painting or even when drawing, it seems more scary for most people to push darker values. I'm not exactly sure why, but most people have this tendency to keep things way too light, and they're more hesitant to push things really dark. So with that in mind, make sure that you've got plenty of darker values. The ceramic artist Isamu Noguchi has a famous quote that I love. His quote is, "You can only understand weight through weightlessness." So you can only understand weight through its opposite, weightlessness. You can only understand brightness or lightness because of its relationship to darkness or dullness. So your value relationships are the most important relationships, visual relationships in your painting for that reason. A dark will only seem dark if there is middle tone and light surrounding it. A light will only seem light if there's middle tone and especially dark as a counterpoint to it. If everything is light, nothing is light. If everything is dark, nothing is dark. So thinking about colors and specifically values as relationships is incredibly essential, not only to art making, but especially to painting, and especially to simulating depth or simulating space, creating visual interest and contrast, all sorts of things. So this, it would be a baseline. This is 5. Let's get a couple more. Let's see. Since I just mentioned that it's kind of psychologically more difficult to push darks, I'm going to give myself a few more darks. Okay, remember we're using fresh paint for each mixture, and make sure that you're putting each mixture or each new pile of paint in a logical place. Okay, remember we're basically making a value scale. Always mix with your palette knife and mix your colors before you apply them. Don't just wing it. Don't just start sticking your brush into this pile of paint and mixing it with this pile of paint and this one, and then applying it, because then you don't really know what you're getting. Also, it's a lot harder to clean your brush than your palette. So if you mixed colors with the brush here and then applied it, then you would stick your brush into here and it would get some of this paint and that one, some of that paint and that one, and it would constantly be changing the colors. The relationship, the game would be changing, and that just doesn't make for a good situation. All right, I'm going to give myself something right here between those two. Now, admittedly, I am an impulsive painter. I love what paint feels like. It's a very sensory experience for me. And in my own work, sometimes I will grab a brush and just, jam it into a color and mix on the canvas or mix with my brush on the palette. But I've also had a lot of experience with that. What I also know, though, is that when I'm going to lighten this pile of paint just a little bit. What I also know is that when I set up my palette in a logical way, which I always do at the beginning of any work day or any painting, then it gives me more control, and it creates more choices for me to get to make in the work. And as we know, in art, especially contemporary art, every single choice matters. Okay? There's so many choices, from how you hold your utensils, to the materials you use, to the amount of focus, to where you place things on the palette, much less just making brush strokes. All right, so what I might do is add a little bit of white, a little bit more pure white paint on the palette. Since I don't have as much of that, I think I'm good to go on the black. There we go. And I'm going to stop this demo for now. The next one is going to be starting your painting. Okay. Remember, I want you to mix all of your colors. In this case, all of the shades of gray, black and white. Mix all of the things you're going to use first before you apply any paint. Okay. And that'll be a really important practice to develop and to stick to, because it will save you time. If you can kind of consolidate your labor, do all of your mixing all together, all of your painting all together, then things will go much quicker, and it'll be an easier way for your brain and your eye to manage the visual problems that we're going to be solving.